Next on AM 1480 WLEA, The Newsmaker Show. Here's Brian O'Neill.
As always, very glad to have with us Dr. Gary Ostrower, the longtime Alfred University history professor. Dr. Ostrower, thanks for coming in.
Hey, thanks for having me here on primary day.
Yes, this is a very interesting one. Senator Kathy Young resigned some months ago, and now there's a primary between Allegheny County Republican county lawmaker Kurt Crandall and Chautauqua County Executive Republican George Borrello. So that's going to be a very interesting one to watch.
Yeah, I don't know at this point, of course, who's going to win this election. I do have a Facebook account, and I might note that every single day on that Facebook account, I get at least one, sometimes even two ads from Borrello. So obviously he has a lot of money. I think it's mainly, contributed by the state Republican committee for his, or at least the Senate Republican committee. But one never knows. I mean, sometimes money doesn't really count in an election like this.
Yeah, we'll just have to see how it all works out today. And it'll be very interesting to find out tonight how that goes. Or maybe, who knows?
Well, most of my predictions are wrong, so I might as well not predict on this one at all.
Talking to Dr. Gary Ostrower. Dr. Ostrower, I was thinking I'd pull up Tucker Carlson's a YouTube of Tucker Carlson from the other night where he was it's kind of interesting, all the different opinions they have at Fox. Sean Hannity on his TV show was very much in favor of military action against Iran after the U.S. drone was shot down. Tucker Carlson did a 20-minute, I'd almost have to say, slam fest, an attack against John Bolton for trying to push President Trump in the direction of military action. So Trump, the story goes that Trump said, "How many people will die if I use military action because of this drone being shot down?" The answer came back 150, and Trump said no. What do you make of that?
Well, number one, I think it's wise that the United States did not launch a armed attack at this point, whether it was 50 people or 150 people or 1,050 people. At this point, I think you got a very volatile situation in the Middle East. It's important, I think, for all of our listeners to understand that a war with Iran is likely to be a very, very destructive war, a very long war. Iran is not Iraq. Iran has a population of more than double that of Iraq. It's easy to get into wars, and it's not so easy to get out of wars. So Tucker Carlson may be onto something here. But I think more importantly, what all this says is that there's clearly disagreement even within the administration. My hunch, and there's no way to prove this, of course, is that had McMaster still been the National Security Advisor and had General Mattis still been the Department of Defense Secretary, there'd be no issue. We would not be attacking Iran, I should say, at this point. But you have the second team in there, and they're divided. John Bolton, it's been said of John Bolton more than once that he's never seen a war that he didn't want to get involved in. He's a hawk, and he's especially been a hawk on Iran. And so that, he is, pushing for military action shouldn't surprise anyone. I think what's a little bit more surprising is that the president himself has hesitated at this point.
Can I jump in, Dr. Ostrower? Can I play a little of the Tucker Carlson clip?
The hangover from an Iraq war would last years. Iran is not Syria or Iraq. It's a big, rich, sophisticated country with an ancient culture and a cohesive population. In some ways, it's an impressive place, not at all like the chintzy prefab capitals of the Arab world, like Riyadh or Dubai. We could beat Iran, but it would not be easy. It would cost trillions of dollars. Many thousands of Americans likely would die. China would love it. They'd be the only winners in that conflict. Donald Trump was elected president precisely to keep us out of disasters like war with Iran. So how did we get so close to starting one? Simple. The neocons still wield enormous power in Washington.
And there's a big picture of John Bolton in the background, and he goes on to slam Bolton numerous times. In fact, he even shows a clip of John Bolton appearing on the Tucker Carlson Tonight Show, where Tucker picks on John Bolton to his face, saying, you have a terrible track record of winning these things.
Well, it's kind of ironic that some of the people who argue the case for war in Iraq, and remember, what happened in Iraq between 2003 and 2010 was one of the great failures in American diplomatic and military history. We've had other failures. We all know what, of course, happened in Vietnam. But I find it ironic that the people who had argued the case for the war in Iraq are also those who are arguing the case for the war in Iran. In other words, we like to say, hey, remember, I'm a historian here, right, Brian? That, we ought to learn the lessons of history. Well, we don't always learn the lessons of history. There's some people who appear, and this would certainly be true of Bolton, to be impervious to learning the lessons of history. One hopes that there's going to be restraint. And clearly at this point there is restraint. But I also think it's important to note that the situation remains volatile. For instance, as recently as 2 days ago, President Trump announced new additional sanctions, in this case on the leaders of Iran. And what that means, in other words, what those sanctions involve are that these guys, and that includes the Ayatollah, who is, the supreme leader, but it also includes the foreign minister, as well as some of the top military officials, that international banking, that international financial agencies are going to be closed off to them. International institutions will be closed off to them. They will not be able to, among other things, use their ATM. Well, it's not a terribly important sanction per se. It's really more symbolic than it is real. But what it also means is that there's going to be retaliation. So, for instance, just this morning, it was reported that the supreme leader, his name is Khamenei, has announced that at this point all negotiations are off the table. In other words, we're not going to have any meaningful contact with Iran. You can't take action at this point in the way that we have, retaliatory action, without expecting a counter reaction. And no one knows exactly what that counter reaction might be. But let me give you a couple of examples of what maybe it will turn out to be. Number one, attacks on Israel. An American ally. Attacks on the United Arab Emirates. Again, an American ally. It may mean cyber warfare, cyber attacks on American banks, on other installations. It may mean the kicking up, the increasing of terror activity in the Middle East. In other words, there are a number of different ways in which the Iranians may react. To think that they're simply going to sit and take this, that they're going to do nothing, I think, would be naive. We got ourselves a situation, and that kind of situation may escalate, leading, in other words, eventually to military action, the very military action that it would appear that President Trump does not want to take right at this moment.
Talking to Dr. Gary Ostrower, I've got a lot in this day in history, and I had some state government questions. Any other Washington topics you want to cover?
Well, yeah, there is one that I would want to cover, but let me make one other comment, if I may, about this Iran thing, because I think, you're onto an important topic here. And if we do wind up in a war, it's going to be probably the most important single topic in calendar year 2019. Iran is and I think that Tucker Carlson made this point, it's a modern country in many ways. And there's no reason to think that all Iranians are united behind the government in Iran. But there is nothing that will unify the population behind the existing regime, nothing more than an American attack. I mean, I think that this is kind of, it's predictable. And I think that's the last thing that we want to do. And so, does President Trump want to appear weak? No. Does he want to take action that may in fact be counterproductive to American interests in the Middle East? No. And so what really will American policy be? And the answer is, at this point, we don't have a very distinct policy. And I think it is worth mentioning this, that the Americans, that is to say the United States government, through Secretary of State Pompeo, has given the Iranians 12 terms, 12 demands. Now maybe some of this is, maybe we're asking for more than we think that we're going to get. But I think it'd be reasonably of interest to know what some of these things are. So they include such things as stop the enrichment of uranium. Now, the Iranians are enriching uranium. Why are they enriching uranium? Because the United States has pulled out of the nuclear agreement with Iran. So there's no agreement, there's no legal reason at this point why the Iranians should not do this. We have said that they have to end the development of missile development. That is to say, end all missile system development on respect to missiles that might carry nuclear warheads. That they have to withdraw from Syria. That they have to end the support for the Taliban in Afghanistan. Well, Brian, I think it stands to reason that this is asking a lot. And are the Iranians going to agree to all of these things? The answer, I think, is clearly no. And if they don't, does this mean again that there's going to be further American escalation in the area? We don't know. And my hunch is that at this point, not even President Trump knows. In other words, we do not have a very clear-cut and a very consistent agreement, a policy, I should say, in respect to a possible war, a possible conflict with that country in the Middle East.
Reading from the J-Post, Jerusalem Post here, Prime Minister, and this is today, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu started the unprecedented trilateral meeting with Russia and the U.S. Tuesday by emphasizing that the three can work together in Syria, especially against Iran. And Netanyahu said Israel will respond forcefully to any attacks from Iran, and that Israel has done that hundreds of times before.
Yeah, well, I think that the Israelis have said that many times before. There's nothing really new in that. But I do think there is something kind of interesting, and that is that you might have, and this is, underline the word might, some kind of a coalition agreement where the U.S. and the Russians are working together, and certainly the Israelis as well. That has not happened in recent years. Most people know, I think, that the Russians have been supporting the Syrian government. The Americans have been very hostile to that Syrian government, and so, of course, have the Israelis. But if there is a larger war in the area, who is going to benefit from that? Tucker Carlson mentioned, well, the Chinese will. You're not kidding, the Chinese will. But it's entirely possible that the Russians will as well. In other words, if you have a vacuum created, let's say in Iran, who's going to fill it? Not the United States from 5,000 miles away. The Russians are on the border, and I think that it's going to further complicate American interests in that area of the world.
Headline from the Washington Post this morning, it says, Bolton says the U.S. would like Iran forces out of Syria.
Sure, we would like Iranian forces out of Syria, but they're not going to leave. Again, they're next door. Okay, they have an interest in that, and countries have to assess what their important national interests are and what they can concede. The Iranians are not they're not going to move away from the Middle East. That's where they live, and there are many of them, 30, 35, 40 million of them, and they have in many ways, as I said, a fairly modern military, and it's a fairly modern country. Brian, you asked about other Washington
that
issues.
was a while ago,
mention
but go
one
ahead.
other issue, and that is that the president was accused once again, we've heard this before, of sexual assault, and this time by a woman who has a lot of credibility. She is a reporter. She writes editorials, columns, I should say, for a magazine called Ellie. Her name is Jean Carroll, and she claims that in the latter part of the 1980s, I believe it is, she was assaulted in the fitting room of a New York City department store. And apparently, and this is what it becomes even more interesting, she had indeed reported this. What she had claimed, she had indeed reported to at least two other people, and there is confirmation that she had said this way back in that earlier period. The president, of course, as usual, has denied it. He says, I didn't know her. And then he said, well, she's not my type. And then he said she's lying. But apparently she she's not lying. And, if my reading of this is correct, the circumstances of this attack constitute what we normally call rape. I don't know what the statute of limitations are, whether there is any kind of statute of limitations in this kind of an assault. But I just leaves me scratching my head that people of conservative sensibilities, people in other words who call themselves conservatives and believe that they have a kind of moral commitment to the rule of law, would tolerate this sort of thing.
Talking to Dr. Gary Ostrower of Alfred University. We're going to take a quick break, check the weather. We'll be back. Stay with us.
With prom and graduation season upon us, it's time for family gatherings and parties. If you are a parent or an adult, there are a few important things for you to remember when hosting a party. It is illegal to provide minors with alcohol or place to party with alcohol. If you serve alcohol to minors, you could face serious legal consequences. This is District Attorney Brooks Baker reminding you that it is never legal for any adult to provide alcohol to someone else's child, even with the permission of that child's parent. Help teens celebrate safely and most of all, celebrate sober this prom and graduation season. This message brought to you by the Steuben Council on Addictions and the offices of the Steuben County Sheriff and District Attorney.
Meteorologist Rob Carroll in time. Rob, how's it going to be today? A little bit warmer?
A little warmer, Brian, a little more humid, and that's going to be the story for the remainder of the week. Front of boundary that brought the rain to the area overnight early this morning is moving off to the east. And we're seeing some clearing out over Lake Erie, already starting to see some breaks in the cloudiness over the southern tier. And that's going to lead to better weather in regards to sunshine as we head through today. A little disturbance up over Michigan, Lake Huron, and up into lower Ontario will head our way this afternoon. That may set off a stray shower or thunderstorm. We're breezy and we're close to 80. Brian, sunrise earlier this morning at 5:35. The sun sets tonight at 8:51. We've cleared to partly cloudy weather with the forecast for tonight. It's going to be a little warmer, a little more humid overnight, 60 to 65. The warm and humid weather is with us tomorrow. We're partly sunny. There could be a shower or a thunderstorm by late tomorrow afternoon. Highs will be 80 to 85. Tomorrow night, clear to partly cloudy. It'll be 60 to 65. Looking ahead to Thursday, we're partly to mostly sunny with highs between 80 and 85. And I see us warm and humid right into the upcoming weekend, Brian.
Thank you, Rob. Back with Dr. Gary Ostrower on this day in history, June of 1942. Eisenhower takes command following, I'm reading up the History Channel's website, following his arrival in London. Major General Dwight D. Eisenhower takes command of the U.S. forces in Europe. Though Eisenhower had not seen combat himself during his 27 years as an Army officer, his knowledge of military strategy and talent for organization were great, and George C. Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff General, chose him over nearly 400 others.
Well, it's an interesting story. You mentioned a moment ago that Eisenhower during World War I had not seen any military action. It's very, very unusual for a general, for a commanding general, not to have been involved in battle. Eisenhower had been, if I remember, and I don't know all the details of this, but he had been heading up a kind of tank training unit, I think, before World War II, and during World War I, and this is very, very early in this whole, when tanks were first being developed. But he wasn't actually ordered over to Europe until the war was over. That is to say, by the time he arrived in France in 1918, the war had ended, so he never actually saw military action of his own. By the same token, he had been a graduate of West Point, and often historians have made the point that he really graduated kind of in the middle of his class, which is true. He wasn't at the top of his class by any means. If I'm not mistaken, he had graduated something like 161 out of about 325 officers, cadets, in the area of strategy and so forth. And then they have another category, and I think it's just the academic category, where he had graduated, I think, around 125. I don't really remember exactly, but he certainly wasn't near the top of his class. But he eventually went to the command college at Fort Leavenworth, and then later, even after that, to the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and in both of those areas he graduated number one of his class. In other words, this man was talented, and it was General George C. Marshall, who becomes becomes the commander, the chief commander of American military, the 5-star general during World War II. And it was Marshall who then selected Eisenhower over about 360 or 370 other military officers who had higher rank. And of course, he appointed Eisenhower to command American forces in Europe. And so Eisenhower did exactly that, initially in Northern Africa, and then in Sicily and in Italy, and then eventually, of course, he became the supreme Allied commander in respect to the invasion of Normandy in 1944. He was a very, very capable commander, and he was a very capable commander, I think, for 3 reasons. Number 1, he was a superb strategist, a really, really good strategist. Number 2, he was an excellent politician. When I say an excellent politician, I mean that he was able to bring people, military officers from England, of course, but also from other Allied countries, and knit them into an effective unit. And nor did he alienate the Russians who were fighting in Eastern Europe on that time. And the third reason why I think he was a very, very good choice for that is because he was very even-tempered. He was not impulsive. He was someone who was willing to plan and plan and plan again. And when he executed those plans, almost always, with one exception, they were successful.
Down to about 60 seconds. Nixon question. Nixon was the vice president for Eisenhower. Did Ike like Nixon?
He did not particularly like him, nor did he respect him. As a matter of fact, in 1956, I believe it was, or maybe it was in 1960, when Nixon was either going to run again for vice president. No, I guess it was in 1960 when Nixon was running for president. Eisenhower was asked, well, what would you credit Nixon for? In other words, what were his major accomplishments as vice president? And Eisenhower said, well, if you give me a couple of days, I'll think of something. So, I think that kind of sums it up. But I might also add very, very quickly, because I know we don't have very much time, that Nixon was involved in a scandal in 1952 when he was first running for vice president with Eisenhower, when Eisenhower was running for president. And it was a kind of, by today's standards, a low-level thing, hardly worthy of attention. But it got a lot of attention back there, and Eisenhower wanted to remove him from the ticket. Eisenhower wanted to replace Nixon with a new vice presidential candidate. Nixon went onto TV. It was the first really effective use by a politician of TV, and he kind of saved his political skin.
He
gave
good Republican dog, a good Republican coat.
That's right. Well, and it was, he had a dog named Checkers, and he said, I'll give back the coats, I'll give back these other gifts that I had received, but I'm not going to give back my dog Checkers, loved by my 2 daughters.
It's a good Republican dog. We got to go.
Well, nice being here, and I'll talk to you guys next week.
Thanks, Gary.